Grand Central breathed like an animal, tracks clattering, announcements echoing, bodies pouring down marble. Calvin kept to the edges, coat thin, eyes scanning for coins or warmth. He didn't expect to see her again in that river of commuters, yet there she was, small in a blue coat, strapped into a chair flashing under old lights. The caregiver stood beside her scrolling, a coffee lid clenched between rings, a surge of luggage and elbows, a suitcase clipped a wheel, a chair shivered and nosed toward the stair's dark mouth. Calvin moved before the scream. He knew the chair's balance, the way momentum lies, the small betrayals of gravity. He'd learned it at the estate, pushing a gentle girl through gardens. The front casters kissed the edge, caught the handles, boots skidding, shoulder thudding the armrest. The girl's eyes were wide, not frightened of him, only of falling. He pulled the chair back 2 feet, then 3. The crowd rippled into not silence, breaths held. The caregiver spun, coffee sloshing, and shrieked, bright as a car alarm. He said it was all right, that she was safe. The caregiver jabbed a finger into his chest and yelled. He tried to push her look. He grabbed her chair. Calvin felt the accusation land before its echo. A transit cop barked from the mezzanine. Hands where I can see them. Taser raised, the red dot jittering on his coat. He loosened his grip, palms open, keeping the chair behind his knees. He said her name softly, the one from Lawns and Fountains. She blinked, recognition flickering, voice trapped far inside. The cop descended fast, boots hard, questions harder. The crowd prepared to believe what fit neatly. Calvin stood still, breath thin, the chair safe, the room tipping on a single lie. The cop's boots stopped a yard away, his arms steady, the dot quivered on Calvin's collarbone. Don't move, he said. Calvin nodded, angling himself to shield the chair. A woman lifted her hand. I saw him grab it before the wheels tipped, she said. Another voice added. The brakes weren't locked, rolled by itself. The caregiver barked back, breath hot with coffee. He came out of nowhere. He grabbed her like a thief. Look at him. Calvin kept his palms open, a posture of harmlessness. The girl's hands lay gentle on the armrests, fingers slack. Only her eyes moved bright and fast, drilling toward Calvin as if tethering herself to something steady in the flood. The cop flicked his gaze between faces, measuring certainty. A nod, a shrug, a fear of getting involved. The crowd wanted a story finished. He wanted paperwork that behaved. Calvin spoke low. I worked for her family at the estate. I know her. The cop's mouth pinched. Name, Calvin Harris. The name tasted like dust when he said it. From the mezzanine, a third witness called. The caregiver wasn't watching. She was buying coffee. The caregiver scoffed, flushing. I was right here. The girl closed her eyes, refusing the lie. The dot slid off Calvin's chest. The cop holstered, not ready for apologies. He checked the chair, tested the brakes, found them locked. He exhaled through his nose like a train. The caregiver demanded they arrest him for touching her patient. The cop told her to take the girl home. Calvin stepped back, heat leaving his shoulders, the crowd dissolving into urgency. As the chair turned, the girl's hand twitched, searching the air. Calvin offered 2 fingers. She caught them briefly, a thank you that lit him like a match against winter. He followed the station's draft toward the doors, lungs burning from nerves rather than speed. Outside, December peeled his heat away. Calvin stood under the clock and let his hands stop shaking. In the glass, he found himself. A man shaped by sidewalks, gray at the temples, coat polished by winters, had held her life again. He had nearly lost his own. Memory cracked like ice. He saw the estate's west lawn, limestone balustrade, the fountain playing music. She'd laugh without sound, eyes bright, while he tucked a blanket around her knees. Back then, the older sister studied abroad and visited rarely, leaving the younger with tutors, nurses, and groundsmen who spoke gently. When the parents traveled, staff kept the house breathing softly. Calvin left after his mother's surgery. Debt swamped him. One mistake, then 2, then the slope where every handhold breaks. The city swallowed him politely, receipt by receipt, until names stopped sticking. He knew better than to return. Houses remember hierarchy, yet the caregiver's face rose in him like smoke. Her relief at his blame came too fast, too bright for innocence. He walked the block twice. If she's her caregiver, why not guard the brakes? Why accuse so wildly? Why deny coffee he could smell? Questions clicked like rails. He needed proof. Homeless men don't get belief. They get warnings. He tucked the thought beside food plans and weather routes, something to hold until opportunity bent his way. Under the arch, the woman in the red scarf passed again. Yes. She paused, recognizing him. Thank you, she said. He nodded, warmed by something older than coffee, something like gratitude. Calvin asked her name and kept it with the girls. If truth required witnesses, he would carry them like lanterns into whatever tunnel the day opened next. That night he walked uptown with weather at back, choosing streets held heat and brick. He knew which grates sang and which stoops kept wind from bones. He slept behind a church where guards were kinder on Tuesdays. Morning found him early, coffee traded for sweeping steps. The priest nodded as if blessing someone he couldn't place. By noon, Calvin reached the block of the estate. The gates wore winter wreaths, berries like lacquer. A guardhouse light burned steady. Delivery vans came and went like choreography. He didn't press the bell. Houses like this, remember. Instead, he waited under a ginkgo with a few stubborn leaves, watching windows the younger girl once loved for garden views. A black SUV returned around too, idling at the curb. The caregiver stepped out, sunglasses low, the girl wheeled beside by a chauffeur. No nurse. He marked it like a pin in cloth. The caregiver guided the chair up the ramp with one hand, phone in the other. Twice she let go to type. Twice the chauffeur caught the handles. Calvin watched, learning rhythm. He circled the block, noting cameras, corners, blind arc of a hedge. If danger came dressed as accident, it would choose places where attention thinned. Curbs, thresholds, doorways, top steps. At dusk, he found the doorman from years past, now in an adjacent building. The man squinted, then smiled.
Alvin.
Harris, he said. The city hasn't finished chewing you yet. They traded small talk until traffic softened. He asked nothing about the family, only whether sports, the elevator, memories drifted loose. The doorman mentioned the sister's temper and money sharpening silence. When the lights brightened inside the estate, he moved away. He wasn't ready to knock. He needed more than suspicion. He needed proof a courtroom couldn't smooth into forgetfulness. Snow threatened but didn't commit, the sky a ceiling of wool. Calvin set his day like a table, small intentions placed in order. First, find witnesses before memory softened edges. He returned to the station with a broom from a friend, joining a crew trading sweeping for platform privilege. Work made him invisible. People talk freely around workers. The red scarf woman arrived with a briefcase and a quick smile. He thanked her again. She scribbled a number on a card and wrote, "Call if anyone questions what I saw." Above, the mezzanine man leaned on the rail. Calvin called up, "You spoke yesterday about the coffee?" The man nodded, named himself Roberto, and said he'd repeat it under oath. Calvin folded the names into his pocket notebook, clumsy with wear. Each line looked like a rung on a ladder set against a wall, so he would climb it even if it splintered. By afternoon, the station's warmth curdled. Delay announcements stacked like plates. Calvin bought a hot dog with change, then gave half to a kid staring at nothing. The mother mouthed thanks. He watched the currents from the shadow of a column. Every wheelchair felt precarious now, every ramp a test. Distractions, breed phones, coffee lids, guilt attention drifts where danger waits. Near 5, a porter told him the cop from yesterday worked nights. Calvin nodded, deciding to wait, not to fight, not to preach, simply remain visible, like a fact that keeps returning. Evening brought the officer, face pinched by lack of sleep. Calvin offered the card with names. "Consider this," he said. The cop read, then tucked it into his vest. Outside, flakes finally committed, fat and few. He watched them melt on his glove, brief proofs, gone quickly. Still, he felt better. It's something that didn't vanish when stared at. 2 days later, snow hardened into gray panes along the curb. Calvin waited where ginkgo branches made a net. When the SUV arrived, he fell into the city's natural tailing distance. The chauffeur moved with the ease of someone paid to think of doors. The caregiver moved like someone paid to be seen. She waved, phone lit. The girl watched clouds drift. It went to a clinic, then a cafe. Twice, the caregiver set the chair on a slope and stepped away to answer a call. Twice, the chauffeur steadied it. Accidents, Calvin told himself, happen like this, made of half-seconds and inches. He noted the angles, the distracted apologies, the way the caregiver's fingers tightened when thanked for nothing. At the curb, the caregiver argued with a delivery biker and let the chair drift until the chauffeur swore. The girl's eyes found Calvin across the street and held. He didn't wave. Shadow work is patient work. He traced routes on a folded map, drawing arrows. Clinic, park, museum ramp, west entrance, the cracked flagstone near the service door. In the park, she parked the chair facing the pond and walked 50 paces to photograph herself. The wind shouldered the chair an inch. Calvin breathed twice, ready to cross. The chauffeur returned with hot drinks. "Where were you?" he asked. "Getting content," she said. The chauffeur said nothing, jaw locked. The girl blinked rapidly, a Morse Calvin couldn't translate. As the light thinned, they headed home. Calvin slipped behind cabs and buses, staying part of traffic. He'd learned to be near without being seen, like a song after silence. At the gate, the caregiver glanced back, sensing something. Calvin turned his face, studied a menu on a lamp. When he looked again, the SUV was gone into the house's mouth. The next morning, he shaved at the shelter sink, trimmed his mustache with a borrowed scissor, and cleaned his coat. Respectability is a key that sometimes turns old locks. He approached the estate at 10, when deliveries softened guards. The man in the booth eyed him, then his screen. Purpose, Calvin asked to leave a message for the family. A house manager emerged, brisk striped scarf tucked perfectly. She studied him as one studies weather. "We remember you, Mr. Harris," she said. "The family isn't receiving unscheduled visits." Calvin nodded. He handed her the card with witness names and the officer. "I helped at the station. There may be danger closer to home than you think. Please keep this safe." Her eyes sharpened. She slid the card into a leather folio. "The younger miss is well cared for," she said. "We have professionals. Your concern is noted." Behind her, through the open door, Calvin glimpsed a hall table crowded with silver frames. One showed the sisters as children, cheeks pressed together, the older standing beside the chair. The manager followed his gaze. "A lovely photograph," she said. "Their parents adored that day. The older is back from Europe. She's taken an active role in care this year." The word clicked. Older. The caregiver wasn't hired help. She was blood. Calvin felt motive settle, heavy and plain. He bowed slightly, thanked them for time, and stepped away. On the sidewalk, he sat on a low wall and breathed. The pieces aligned too neatly to ignore, yet nothing he had would endure a courtroom's light. He needed something undeniable. A voice behind him. "Mr. Harris?" The doorman from next door had followed. "The older sister can be impatient," he said. "If you're careful, you might catch that on camera." Calvin didn't own a phone that could film. At the soup line, Jesse knew a pawn shop swapping labor for older models. By evening, Calvin had a cracked screen and hope. He learned the camera's stubborn focus, how the mic caught wind and missed voices. He taped a corner to mute rattle, practiced holding still until elbows remembered stone. At dawn, he walked routes he'd marked, checking sightlines and reflections. Storefront glass can be a friend if you stand right. He set lookouts, museum ramp, and the park gate. By mid-morning, the SUV rolled out. He trailed, never closer than a bus length. The chauffeur watched mirrors. The caregiver took selfies. The girl watched the city slide by. They stopped at the museum. Calvin rested against a trash can, camera cupped low. The caregiver steered halfway up the ramp, released the handles to search her phone, and looked away. The chair rolled inches. The chauffeur darted, corrected, spoke through his teeth. The caregiver laughed like bells. Calvin checked the screen, caught it. Small, but a thing that moved. We filmed in the park. The chair left on a camber while the caregiver filmed the pond. The wind pushed a nudge. The chauffeur saved it. On video, intent cast shadow. Calvin didn't want a disaster. He wanted proof of flirted disasters. Kept his distance, heart angry and calm at once. The girl's eyes found him and didn't flinch. On the avenue, a cab swerved close, horn long. The caregiver scolded the driver, theatrical as a play. Calvin rewound and watched her hands nowhere near the brakes until after fear. That night he charged the phone at a shelter outlet, guarding it with knees and folded arms. He watched the clips twice, not everything, but a beginning that didn't blink. He met the night shift cop again, near Lost and Found, where voices came softer. Calvin held the phone like a fragile animal and said, "I think someone keeps building accidents around her." The cop's eyelids looked sanded. He set his coffee on the rail and watched the first clip, then the second. On the tiny screen, the chair's inch looked bigger than an inch. "You see it?" Calvin said. "Maybe," the cop answered. "Maybe I see a careless caretaker and a quick chauffeur. Maybe I see you filming a minor. Maybe I see trouble." Calvin swallowed. He kept his voice even. "I worked at their estate. I know the girl. The caregiver is her sister. Motive sits in the will, if you look hard enough." The cop rubbed his brow. He wasn't the villain, Calvin feared, only a tired man with rules in his pocket. He'd pass it to a detective if Calvin got names on paper. "Names I have," Calvin said, touching the pocket notebook. "Dates, too. Slopes. Ramps. Times she looked away." The cop nodded. He wrote a number and said, "Send what you have." Back at the shelter, Jesse helped him email files from a grimy computer. The subject line felt like a dare. Possible pattern of neglect resulting in risk of harm. Calvin didn't sleep much. Heat hammered, lights too bright. He replayed the clips and kept seeing old moments grow fangs in the dark. Morning brought a single message. Receipt acknowledged. No promises. Calvin took it like bread meager, but something. He made a backup on a thumb drive Jesse loaned him, insurance against lost attention. Outside, the sky bruised towards snow again. He drew his coat tight and felt, beneath hunger and dread, a seam of steadiness. He'd done the next right thing. Tomorrow required another. The third week brought bright cold and sharp shadows. The SUV pulled up at Central, where stories repeat. Calvin stationed himself opposite the stairwell, camera warm in his pocket. The caregiver guided the chair toward the elevator, then pivoted at the last moment toward the promenade above the steps. The chauffeur lagged, boxed by luggage and a tourist. Calvin felt the air change before motion did. The caregiver's hand lifted from the grip as she turned to chat with a friend. The chair drifted toward polished stone, toward the mouth. He crossed fast. The camera saw first. His hands followed. He caught the handles and set the brakes with his thumb, a practiced click that steadied his heart. The caregiver spun, outrage preloaded. "You again," she snapped. "People are helping us," he said. "Help by getting out of the way." Her smile toward the friend arrived beats late. The chauffeur arrived, breath short, eyes telling a story his mouth wouldn't. He thanked Calvin without words and rolled the chair toward the elevator. The friend drifted off, allegiance undecided. A small crowd formed, the way crowds do when fear grazes marble. A woman whispered, "That's the man from last time." A man said, her hand left before the chair moved. Calvin filmed their faces as they spoke, then their boots as they went, privacy protected, testimony saved. The cop from Nights stepped into the light and chose to watch. The caregiver met Calvin's eyes across the gap. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Something cold looked out. He felt it the way you feel, weather behind glass. The elevator doors closed on chrome reflections. Calvin tucked the phone into his coat and understood the next part. The files could hold. Now he needed a moment no one could deny. Calvin returns to the station at dawn, not for warmth, but for alignment. He wants the morning's logic. Commuters flowing, lights waking, edges softened by coffee, steam, and boots. He studies the stair where luck nearly ended a life. Times elevator cycles and watches shadows crawl across the marble, marking where cameras see and where they grow blind again. A transit cleaner recognizes him and nods. They share a rail for a minute, trading quiet. The cleaner murmurs that trouble repeats like schedules. If danger failed once, it often tries again. Calvin's cracked phone hums with a reply. The detective wants a fuller statement. He scrolls the short message until the pixels blur, relieved to be asked for words instead of apologies. He writes above the rush, printing carefully from memory. Dates, angles, distances, who spoke, who swore. He draws arrows toward the stairs and circles the places silence gathers. Below, a wheelchair cuts the crowd and he flinches, then exhales. When it turns toward food, he reminds himself fear is useful until it burns the truth he is gathering. He leaves and walks uptown, letting winter polish his thinking. The estate sits ahead like a problem, elegant, guarded, holding rooms that used to know his footsteps. The house manager meets him at the gate unexpectedly, scarf neat, eyes sharp. She says the family is out, then asks if he will repeat what he sent the police. They stand near the mouth of the drive where tires whisper. His words feel heavy yet calm. She listens without interrupting, fingers quiet on her folio, a metronome keeping just as his tempo. Before she goes, she tells him the older sister requested fewer staff this month. He thanks her and feels the phrase settle darkly. Fewer hands means fewer witnesses. Danger travels lighter. The detective meets Calvin in a quiet corner where heat rises and shoes whisper. He offers coffee and says, "Start at the beginning, then don't stop." Calvin speaks in the order life delivered things. Estate years, gentleness, debt, falling the station, the lies, the witnesses, the videos. The detective's pen moves like a needle. "Did she benefit if something happened?" the detective asks. Calvin says the older sister is likely the heir if guardianship shifts, if grief launders cruelty. He suggests looking at trusts and dates. The detective tucks this away without comment. He asks about the chauffeur. Loyal? Afraid? Calvin says both can be true, and fear often wins until someone else holds the door. They walk the mezzanine to see sightlines. Calvin shows how the blind spot bloomed, how panic shaped stories. The detective nods toward the steps, as if listening to yesterday. In the afternoon, Calvin waits outside the estate, hands pocketed against wind. The chauffeur steps out for a smoke and notices him, smoke ghosting around their truce. He doesn't confess, not exactly, but he says low that the chair is heavier in winter. The park wind hits from the west, and some people like watching things roll. Calvin asks one question. "Would you speak if I spoke first?" The man stares at the tip and says I'd stand nearby. Sometimes nearby is the bravest place available. Snow begins again, half-hearted. Calvin thanks him and returns downtown. The detective's card weighs in his pocket, a small promise he refuses to romanticize. Promises are best tested, not framed. That night he writes a letter he cannot deliver, addressed to the girl. He tells her he believes her eyes. He vows to keep showing up until the truth stands. The lawyer's office sits above a bakery, windows fogged with sugar. Calvin takes the stairs slowly, hat in hands, the waiting room smelling of glue and newsprint. The receptionist asks if he has an appointment, says no, but he has a question about a trust. She studies his coat, then his eyes, and brings a glass of water. When the junior attorney arrives, sharp suit, softer voice, Calvin explains he once worked for the family and worries about the younger sister's safety. He asks about guardianship and heirs. The attorney doesn't answer specifics, but mentions that sudden changes in care or staff can raise review flags. He advises concerned parties to document patterns and notify the court if necessary. Calvin leaves with nothing concrete and exactly what he needed. Confirmation that paper can hear if spoken correctly. Outside, he breathes bakery air and tastes sugar he didn't buy. At the estate gate, the house manager meets him with cooler courtesy. She hands him a folded knit scarf and says, "From the younger miss." Calvin swallows, grateful and careful at once. Through the open door, he glimpses the grand staircase shining like a promise, thinks of wheels, edges, boots, and how marble forgets the difference between ceremony and fall. That afternoon, he films from the sidewalk as the older sister guides the chair toward the top step for photographs, a stunt wrapped in sweetness. The chauffeur hovers, jaw tight, eyes sick. The sister laughs when the driver suggests moving. The chair inches. The driver lunges. Calvin catches it in the reflection of the silver door. Intent wearing glamour, danger dressed as devotion. At night, he emails the attorney, the detective, and the cop. He writes plain sentences, dates, distances, attaches the clip, and ends. Please see before grief arrives. The older sister spots him one brittle morning and crosses like she owns the asphalt. Her sunglasses are mirrors. He sees himself small within her moving world. "You're following us," she says. He says he's walking the city like everyone else. She steps closer, perfume hard as coin, and whispers that police dislike cameras near children. He doesn't rise. He lets the street speak. Buses, coughing, pigeons, scolding, a courier singing off-key. When he answers, it's this: safety isn't a threat to anyone honest. She smiles a made-for-press smile. Then she leans in, voice thin as ice, and asks what someone like him might want to stop being underfoot. He hears the bribe she won't name. Before he can answer, the chauffeur returns with bags. The girl watches from the chair, eyes steady as fixed stars. One gloved finger curls when the sister touches her shoulder. The house manager opens the door and pauses, taking in the tableau. The sister's posture, the driver's jaw, Calvin's stillness, the girl's turning eyes. Something unreadable flashes across the manager's face. Detective Ortiz arrives a beat later, unofficial visit by calendar chance. He notes where everyone stands, like a director stepping onto a set after rehearsal caught bad light. The sister pivots smoothly, greeting the detective with warmth that never reaches her pupils. She speaks of privacy, of harassment, of respect owed to families who pay taxes on time. Ortiz listens, tipping his head so a shade of winter slips from brim to cheek. He asks if they can talk inside. The sister declines sweetly. Hey. The manager coughs and invites him anyway. Calvin leaves without being asked, because exits are sometimes arguments won. As he rounds the corner, he hears Ortiz say, "Let's review safety at the stairs, to be thorough." Inside, Ortiz keeps his questions simple and dull on purpose, the kind that lulled truth into stretching. Asks about brakes, thresholds, shoes with grip, who signs logs. The house manager produces a binder with tabs the color of weather. The sister smiles as if parent-teacher night went perfectly, but her tapping foot reveals a metronome without music. Ortiz suggests adding a wedge at the top of the grand staircase, a rubber lip that forces awareness. The sister says the house is historic. The manager promises to order 3. Afterward, Calvin returns to the sidewalk ambush of winter. He watches deliveries and routines. He notes the chauffeur hovers closer now, orbit tightened by gravity named doubt. 2 days later, the museum again. New signs sprout at the ramp. Hold handles. Engage brakes. The sister poses the chair for photos anyway, angling light like a stylist on deadline. Calvin films from a bench, pretending to study a map. A child spills cocoa nearby. The air smells like chocolate and wool. The chair noses forward. The chauffeur corrects, jaw clenched. The sister turns sharply on him, whispering a scold that carries. She calls him dramatic, says gravity loves a stage, laughs in a key that curdles milk. Calvin records the edge. When the girl's eyes find him, he raises the map as if considering dinosaurs. She blinks slowly, a rhythm he recognizes now as yes. He lowers the phone and breathes patience. A guard approaches and asks him to stop filming guests. Calvin apologizes and pockets the phone. Sometimes the right thing wears the wrong coat. He thanks the guard for guarding. Outside, snow works in earnest. He sends Ortiz the clip and a note. She favors the edge over the view. Ortiz replies with one line, "Keep distance, not courage." The parents return from a trip that looked like rest online and tasted like jet lag in the hall. The house blooms with voices, coats, and the careful ritual of homecoming. The house manager asks Calvin to stop by the service entrance at noon, quiet and unannounced. He arrives clean-shaven, scarf folded, carrying a notebook and the steadiness he's built. In a narrow office near the laundry, he meets the mother first. She remembers him after a moment, the way one recalls a song from a summer 5 years gone. She thanks him for the station, then asks why he is still here. He says the safest place near a cliff grows deadly when someone loves the drop more than the view. The father arrives, wary, protective of the older daughter's pride. The manager translates caution into logistics, mentioning wedges installed, logs signed, a detective's visit, and fresh signage elsewhere. The older sister appears in the doorway, smiling without softness. She calls Calvin a stalker with a camera. The mother's mouth tightens. The father's hand settles on a chair as if anchoring. A visiting nurse crosses the hall with a chart. She notes that the younger's palms show new bruising consistent with gripping hard during stress. Silence expands and touches everything. Calvin does not look at the sister. He watches the mother watching her. A decision stirs like weather changing. The manager writes a note and folds it with care. Ortiz arrives later with a community officer and leaves pamphlets about accessible safety. He walks the staircase with the parents, naming small dangers and the habits that cure them. That night, Calvin sleeps at the church again. He dreams not of falling, but of a wedge of rubber, humble and black, holding a wheel with authority, needing no badge. A week later, a message reaches Calvin through the manager. The sisters will travel north for fresh air. He reads it twice and tastes the lie inside the phrase. He stations himself at the platform an hour early, learning the wind, the hum in the rails, the impatient warnings of the gap. He notes where crowd funnels and where attention thins. The SUV arrives with haste. The older sister waves at no one, phone lifted, lips set for a photo that will sell concern. The chauffeur unloads a weekend's comfort. The girl watches the rails, not the lens. Calvin moves to Pillar's back and angles his body to shield his camera from staff tired of anyone filming sorrow for sport. The chair noses close to the yellow line as the sister adjusts a scarf, then turns to sign a receipt. The chauffeur reaches, a passerby gasps. Calvin takes 2 steps and steadies. Her mouth becomes theater. She accuses him again, a script she knows, voice pitched for audience. A conductor frowns, glances at the gap, then at the girl's white knuckles. Ortiz appears, summoned by a text from the manager. He asks everyone to breathe, then steps them back from the edge, as if Cliff's respected requests. Calvin shows his footage. The conductor mentions platform rules. A commuter says she saw the hand leave the handle. The sister says grief makes people dramatic long before grief actually arrives. It is that sentence that thins the air. The mother, who came to surprise them, hears it from behind a pillar and goes quiet, then emptier than quiet. Ortiz meets her eyes. He asks the sister to accompany him to a small office. She refuses and then agrees. The girl's eyes find Calvin and hold, steady like lights that won't blink. The station office, the fluorescent lights hum like bees. Ortiz offers water that nobody drinks. He places his notebook on the table and lets silence sand the room's edges. Sister starts with outrage, then pivots to exhaustion. She speaks of pressure, a life bent around a sister's needs, the cruelty of strangers with phones. Her voice is almost convincing. The mother sits with hands woven together so tightly they tremble. She asks no questions, only watches. Ortiz asks, 3. Who held the handles? Why photos near stairs? Why deny coffee? The answers circled themselves without landing. Ortiz writes phrases, not sentences. He notes times, then pauses. The sister accuses Calvin again, says he obsesses over her family and their name. Outside, Calvin waits with the chauffeur and the girl. The scarf she sent him is around his neck. He touches it involuntarily whenever a door opens, as if it were a bell. The chauffeur says nothing, but his silence chooses sides. The girl's eyes move between them and the office door, tracking hope like a small bird that keeps finding windows.
Ours!
Ortiz opens the door and asks Calvin to speak plainly. The mother nods. He lays out the pattern. Slopes wedges refused, hands leaving handles, rehearsed words, bruises on palms. He doesn't mention wills or money. He talks about gravity and attention, about love measured by distance from edges. How safety looks boring until it saves a life. The mother closes her eyes and opens them with something new inside. She asks the manager, who has arrived breathless, to pull logs and camera angles from the weak wedges arrived. Ortiz thanks everyone, collects cards, and says they'll review together tomorrow. As they leave, the sister's eyes pass over Calvin like weather. The girl's eyes stay warm and unafraid. The review happens in the estate's small theater, velvet dimming daylight. The manager runs the remote while parents, Ortiz, the lawyer, and Calvin sit in a row like reluctant jurors. Footage blooms. The museum ramp with signs ignored, the park camber and gloves, the grand staircase glinting with holiday. Angles miss faces but catch hands, and hands tell almost everything. They pause where the chauffeur lunges, where the sister laughs, where the chair noses inches, and someone rescues normal with a quick wrist. The room inhales and forgets to exhale. Calvin's reflection clip plays, silver door making a screen from weather. The sister watches herself through herself and calls the image distorted. Ortiz says reflections sometimes tell the straightest truth. The lawyer clears his throat and says procedures should change immediately. Staff levels must return. The sister says theatrics won't teach a house to love ramps. The mother's shoulders rise, then drop. A camera shows a blurred moment near the interior landing, a blind spot by design. The manager notes wedges were not yet installed then, they are now. Silence and carpet drink time. The father asks the sister to step out. She refuses. He asks again. She leaves, slamming nothing, just air. Doors cushion anger here. Restraint wears silk and a practiced spine. The lawyer recommends suspending the sister from care duties pending review. Ortiz agrees. The mother says yes, like a prayer unsure it deserves an answer. Calvin stares at his hands. The manager schedules an outside nurse for each outing and installs a sign-in board impossible to forge with a flourish. The house begins choosing safety over appearances. Afterward, in the hall, the girl reaches out as Calvin passes. He stops, offers fingers. She presses once, grateful. He breathes and believes the tide is finally shifted. Suspension chafes like wool on a summer neck. 2 nights later, the sister returns unannounced, breezing past the gate with a smile that opens locks. A temp hesitates. Calvin, delivering notes, sees her across the foyer. Yes. She coos toward the nursery wing where a music box plays. The girl sits by the window, night garden silvered. The sister suggests fresh air. She unclips a latch and rolls the chair toward the terrace. Calvin keeps pace along the hedge, phone low, heart steady from practice. At the top of the garden steps, she pauses for a photo, backlit by porch lamps. The chair edges the first riser. The pond holds moon like a coin waiting to be spent. Calvin reaches the side path and sets a foot against the rear wheel, casual as a gardener resting. The chair stops. The sister's smile flickers, a candle remembering wind. House cameras bloom. Ortiz appears on the terrace with the father, responding to a ping. The mother follows, robe tied, eyes not soft this time. The sister starts talking about stars, nostalgia, promise, freedom. Ortiz points to the wedge at the threshold, to the unlocked brake, to the distance between handles and hands, and doesn't raise his voice. The father takes the chair and rolls it back onto level stone. The mother tells the sister she can't be here tonight. The pond resumes, holding its borrowed moon silently. Ortiz turns to Calvin and nods in a way that is almost thanks. He says charges may follow and asks if Calvin can stay nearby. The manager returns and offers a guest room. In that small room, Calvin laces his boots and finally unlaces his shoulders. The girl sleeps down the hall, breath even. Outside, winter rehearses another storm, and for once, nobody moves. Dawn found Calvin awake before the house, listening to heat tick and old pipes stutter. The guest room carried lavender, a softness he hadn't earned yet, but guarded carefully. Down the hall, a nurse wheeled past with a tray, slippers whispering. The house breathed differently without the sister's orbit. Less show, more rhythm. Calvin felt the change like weather. He folded the scarf she'd sent, smoothing pilled edges. Gratitude mixed with vigilance, a strange alloy. He had slept, his muscles said so. His mind kept watching stairs while dreaming gardens. Ortiz arrived with frost on his coat and a seriousness that never threatened. He asked for a walkthrough and collected the manager's logs, staff statements, maintenance orders, and delivery time stamps. Together they tested the wedges, pressed brakes, rolled thresholds slowly. The nurse demonstrated protocols with patience crisp as linen. The parents watched everything, learning how safety looks boring and absolute. The chauffeur offered tea, cheeks windburned, eyes steadier. He apologized to Calvin for staying quiet too long. Calvin said nearby mattered, and nearby sometimes keeps gravity from finding a stage. Mid-morning a call. The lawyer's voice was flint-wrapped and felt. The court granted an emergency order limiting the sister's access. An investigator would review trust documents and guardianship provisions. The mother sat, hands flat, as if bracing for waves. She thanked Calvin with few words and eyes. The father exhaled, then began phoning broadened staff, rebuilding watchfulness like scaffolding. Calvin visited the girl's room last, knocking though she couldn't answer. Window light watered the fern. He told her the steps were safer, his voice low, carrying promises like tools. Eyes held his without panic now, a steady yes that strengthened him. He adjusted her blanket, checked the brakes, and watched winter brightening the terrace stones without sharpening edges. Afternoon, Ortiz returned with 2 officers and a call emergency. He asked the chauffeur to sit with him privately. Doors closed, but voices carried cadences of truth finally stepping forward. Calvin waited in the kitchen, metal and steam. The cook offered soup and kept conversation practical. How ramps gather crumbs. How wheels scuff baseboards. How worry tastes when it burns. The house manager copied logs and sealed them. She handed Ortiz a folder thick as a winter scarf. He nodded, placed it carefully, as if weight were evidence too. The mother stood behind a chair, not sitting. The father asked what came next. Ortiz answered quietly. A warrant application, interviews, safeguards kept strict until courts chose words. Evening arrived with the hush of snow. The sister's lawyer called, voice polished, questions clipped. Ortiz repeated that access was limited and safety documented. He asked for cooperation. In the guest room, Calvin gathered his tapes, charging cords, and the thumb drive Jesse had blessed. He labeled everything with dates and places, handwriting steady, script learning to be official. He wrote a statement again, this time starting with how kindness taught him wheels, before law did. He included names of strangers who had spoken when silence seemed easier. He stopped by the girl's door. The nurse nodded, shifted. He showed the girl the labeled drive and tapped his chest. Then pointed toward Ortiz. She blinked twice, luminous with trust. Downstairs, Ortiz accepted the packet and said he'd courier it tonight. He clapped Calvin's shoulder once, a gesture that meant work shared and sleep earned, if sleep came. Calvin stepped outside, drawing cold into his lungs like medicine. Snow thickened. Somewhere a bell counted hours, counted gratitudes, heat, witnesses, wedges, and a detective who listened. Morning broke with quiet decisions. Ortiz texted a single word, granted. The warrant traveled faster than gossip, arriving with measured steps and clipped exchanges that didn't mistake volume for strength. The sister returned mid-morning, eyes bright as lacquer, smile engineered. Lawyer's confidence clung like perfume. She stepped inside and found not an audience but a hallway that chose distance. Ortiz met her near the sitting room, officers behind him like bookends. He spoke low, precise. Paper rustled, signatures requested presence downtown. She refused, then complied, anger schooled into poise. The mother watched from the doorway, chin high, grief sober. The father didn't hide relief. It looked like exhaustion retreating. The manager stood very straight, hands quiet, a steward of weather. Calvin remained in the kitchen, hearing voices meet and separate. He didn't celebrate because victory too early breeds carelessness. He washed dishes until metal shone like concentration. As they led her through the vestibule, the sister passed the girl's chair and paused to perform tenderness. The girl stared beyond her, holding nothing offered, gripping the armrest white. In that grip lay testimony. Ortiz saw it. So did everyone who had learned to read the hand's honest language. The sister's smile slipped, then returned, thinner edges showing. On the stoop, Snow answered boots with soft replies. A neighbor watched through lace and pretended not to. The city took the sister the way it takes any storm with paperwork. Inside, the mother sat finally, the chair receiving her like harbor. The father closed a door with care as if gentleness could become policy and stay. Calvin stepped onto the terrace and breathed until his shoulders fell. He didn't feel triumph, only a steadier climate. He whispered thank you to the hedges and the woman who trusted him. The district attorney's office settled into the case like careful hands relearning an instrument. He scheduled interviews in a room with soft chairs and harsh lights that told the truth. Calvin arrived wearing a borrowed tie and a coat brushed clean. The house manager had pressed his shirt, offering nothing beyond practicality, which tasted like respect more than speeches do. An assistant DA asked about history, the estate, why he left, and how winter feels on marble when your rent is weather and your doorbell is hunger. He answered plainly. They did not avoid the word homeless. Calvin was grateful for that. They asked what dignity looks like when it has to be carried in pockets. He pointed to witnesses and wedges. The chauffeur described small saves, and the nurse spoke charts instead of stories. The manager confessed to intuition she'd ignored and would not ignore again. Practical people became chorus. A defense lawyer tried to paint Calvin as obsessed, lonely, hungry for relevance. The assistant DA slid the videos across the table. Gravity argued better than Calvin ever could. Ortiz laid out the timeline until motive looked less like conjecture and more like arithmetic. Access decreased, stunts increased, witnesses grew brave. Paper learned to see what stone knew. Calvin worried about the girl, how testimony excludes those without words. The nurse described her palms, the patterns of stress, the relief after wedges, the recognition when Calvin entered. The Ada asked what Calvin wanted if the case succeeded, said quiet, safety, and routine. He said a garden path that remembers footsteps, not headlines. He said a job. When he left, the hallway smelled like coffee and copied paper. The elevator mirrors showed a man reassembled. He held the scarf at his throat and promised to keep standing still. Arraignment turned the sister into a calendar of dates and conditions. Bail arrived heavy with numbers and lighter with terms than some expected. Cameras gathered because Winter News loves indoors. Calvin entered through a side door, coat collar raised, avoiding lenses that make simple faces into symbols. He wasn't a symbol, he was a man who held handles. Sister's lawyer spoke in paragraphs, polished smooth. The judge listened without polishing back. Ortiz sat 2 rows behind Calvin, sipping air, eyes trained on a page he knew. Outside, microphones hunted reaction. The parents said nothing. The house manager said procedures had changed and would continue to change until boredom felt like love again, because safety is repetition. Between dates, life recalibrated. Calvin shadowed the nurse, learning med schedules, transfer techniques, the ballet of harness and patience. He practiced turning without jarring, stopping without drama, listening without words. The girl rewarded competence with ease. Her eyes laughed sometimes, a silent chime. She tolerated his jokes about spinach and winter. He showed her the scarf, and she blinked, yes, twice. Paperwork sprouted. The parents, with counsel, petitioned for Calvin to become a formal caregiver under agency supervision. Guardianship remained with them. Trust moved like furniture into safer rooms. Calvin returned to the garden he once polished for parties. He learned the winter route without ice, the angle where sun-warmed stone at midday, the pond's habit of fog. Neighbors waved from distances appropriate to fences. Some apologized, others offered cookies uncomfortably. Calvin took kindness without weighing it against yesterday. He saved everything that held, threw away nothing. On the terrace one evening, he read aloud from a cookbook, as if it were a novel. She listened, smiling in the light like a girl sitting where danger no longer rehearsed. Winter sharpened, the sky rinsed to steel. Trial preparation turned days into folders. Ortiz stopped by less, saying more with shorter visits. The machine moved without needing announcements anymore. The sister, through channels, sent a message painting herself as misunderstood devotion. The attorney forwarded it to Ortiz and replied with policy. Calvin read it once and felt nothing new. At home, routine layered into ritual. Calvin and the nurse built a blink code. Yes, twice, no once, slow maybe. The girl learned it faster than anyone expected, joy quickening her gaze. He narrated everything. Ramps, brakes, blankets, transfers, the tease, steam, words-wrapped actions, making them gentle. The house breathed with them, adjusting to sentences that steadied hands. They practiced weather days. He taught her hat first, scarf second, gloves last. She taught him patience with doors that open slower if you treat them like stubborn friends. Neighbors began bringing ordinary news. Whose dog escaped? Which delivery man sings? Which tree keeps confetti leaves longest? The girl listened, eyes bright, collecting neighborhood-like postcards. At night, Calvin wrote a list titled After. He included embarrassingly simple things like library cards, shoelaces without knots, a garden bench sanded smooth, a stove that remembers simmer. Ortiz called to confirm witness order. Cleaner, red scarf, mezzanine man, chauffeur, nurse, manager, and Calvin. Each name felt like a rung again, a ladder standing, less likely to splinter. The mother asked Calvin to sit with them for dinner sometimes. He did, talking about soups and movies, never about marble or edges. The father laughed easier when danger slept. In bed, he watched the ceiling and didn't see stairwells. He thanked the scarf, the wedges, the people who said I saw. He slept with shoulders that learned peace again. Courtrooms make time move in squares. Morning slid into benches, benches into oaths. The judge's voice was dry timber, strong, not shouting. 12 citizens arranged themselves into attention in winter sweaters. Broom leaned outside. Broom leaned outside. Described rails, schedules, how trouble repeats. The red scarf woman spoke next, calm, precise, remembering breaks, inches, and truths, small enough to fit pockets. The mezzanine man, Roberto, pointed at photos, identifying angles. The chauffeur followed, voice low, admitting saves he hadn't documented and feared he'd tried to swallow into professionalism. Silence afterward honored honesty. The nurse brought charts like maps. She explained palms turning purple from gripping during stress, then fading after wedges in routine. The manager described procedures, humility, and the day safety outranked appearance. Videos played. The ramp, the camber, the stair. Gasps came quiet, like air choosing its own weight. Gravity did the talking. The room learned the accent. Calvin finally took the stand, told stories in order, never gilded, admitted mistakes that made him homeless, then named kindness that kept him human anyway. He kept his hands still. Defense asked why he filmed. He said because no one believes pockets. They asked if he wanted a job. He said yes, the job of keeping her ordinary and safe. They suggested obsession. He suggested attention, which looks similar until someone falls. The judge sustained and overruled in turns, shaping lanes neither side could leave without spilling. The girl attended quietly in a side room, a screen showing proceedings. When Calvin mentioned gardens, her eyes softened. When videos rolled, her fingers twitched, then relaxed. The jury noticed. Leaving the stand, Calvin exhaled like finishing a long staircase. Ortiz nodded once. The Ada smiled without showing teeth, a promise to finish the marathon as steadily as they'd begun. Jury time is elastic. Clocks lie politely. They left with binders of weight and returned sooner than some hoped, later than others feared. The foreperson stood like a lighthouse, guilty, on counts that measured recklessness and endangerment with formal language. The room didn't cheer, it breathed. The sister stared ahead, expression lacquered, then cracked when she searched for an audience. The judge set sentencing for next month. Custody continued. Lawyers rustled, collecting dignity into briefcases. Ortiz exhaled through his nose, then looked for Calvin, found him, and nodded once. The mother reached for the father's hand. The manager closed her eyes. The nurse wiped at a corner she pretended was dust. The chauffeur stared at his shoes, then smiled small. In the side room, the girl watched the screen flash words she couldn't say. Her hands relaxed, her shoulders dropped a fraction. The nurse squeezed her glove. Relief learned her shape. Calvin stood very still and let gratitude arrive deliberately, not spilling. He thanked the people who believed what they saw. He thanked shoes that chose brakes over fashion. Outside, winter felt less sharp, though weather hadn't changed. Reporters asked for statements. The parents declined. Calvin said only, "We're going home," and meant the kind of safety that fits rooms. Back at the estate, the fountain's winter scaffold clinked in the breeze. The girl rolled past the grand staircase with wedges shining like small oaths kept. The house seemed to exhale. That night, dinner was soup with bread tearing properly. They didn't toast, they ate. The mother laughed once at nothing and everything. What? The father asked about movies again. Calvin checked the doors, the brakes, the blankets. He stood by the window and watched frost sketch its lines. He allowed himself a single, quiet yes before turning out the light. Sentencing day arrived with buds trembling on branches, winter loosening its jaw. The courtroom felt less haunted. People sat closer without noticing, as if weather had moved indoors. Impact statements spoke gently but firm. The nurse describing stress on hands, the manager describing policies, the father describing sleepless thresholds, the mother describing silence pressed into daily bread. Calvin's turn came last. He spoke little, saying stares teach truths about priorities. He said safety is ordinary love made visible. Said forgiveness sometimes requires distance and doors. The sister looked past him, eyes shiny but not wet. The judge spoke in even tones, weighing premeditation, pattern, and risk. A sentence arrived that belonged to calendars, not rumors. Afterward, in a smaller courtroom, papers shifted differently. The parents, with counsel, formalized Calvin as primary caregiver within an agency's oversight. With contingencies if they traveled or health required guardianship transfer, the judge asked Calvin if he accepted. He said yes, as if accepting a key to a garden long tended from outside the fence. He promised to keep things ordinary. He celebrated with sandwiches in the kitchen. Laughter returned to shelves that had stored only caution. The cook joked about adding ramps to recipe cards. The chauffeur brought pastries. Back home, the girl watched the terrace, sun edging stone like butter on toast. Calvin adjusted her scarf and named birds dragging thread toward nests, tugging winter loose. He walked her past the grand staircase slowly, not to triumph, but to practice boredom. The wedges looked almost pretty now, like subtle jewelry on a dress that fits living. That evening, he sat by her window and read a travel guide as if it were poetry. Places became textures. Distance became patience. They watched spring rehearse the shape of ease. Weeks later, in quieter court, a petition matured. The parents requested Calvin named co-guardian, with authority when travel or health required. The judge agreed, pen scratching a future into present responsibilities. Calvin signed carefully, letters steady as ramps. He did not feel promoted, felt correctly placed. The girl watched from beside the clerk, eyes bright, hands relaxed like open doors. Home changed in ways only sound records. Fewer hurried footsteps, more clinks of mugs, chairs moved back gently. The staircase became scenery again, no longer a character demanding lines. Calvin built small rituals. Wednesday park loops, Thursday recipe readings, Friday mail sorting like treasure. The nurse taught him lifts that saved backs and egos. He practiced invisible heroism. On Saturdays, the parents invited neighbors for soup and quiet music. The girl shone. People learned to wait for her eyes, to listen without harvesting words. Community changed shape around attention. Spring finally convinced the pond to release its last glass. Robin stitched morning into afternoons. Calvin planted herbs in boxes, naming each leaf, promising soups that smelled like hope. He found the old bench under the beach and sanded splinters into smooth. He pushed the chair there slowly, brakes setting with the old practiced click that once saved lives. He spoke softly about thresholds, about how doors respect patience. He promised boredom abundant as bread. She blinked yes. They watched bees argue politely with blossoms, both winning. Stied the scarf hung by the door, clean and ready. The wedges caught a stray ray of sun-like metals for quiet wars nobody televised. Ordinary reigned again, stubborn and kind. When evening arrived, he wheeled her along the path that remembers footsteps. The house glowed. He felt seen without spectacle, necessary without noise, and exactly where a promise belongs.